Hello, my friends. It is July 26, 2019, and we are here with our buddy Teo Nilakoulis. I just totally butchered your name, man.
Gee, that's okay. I still love you, man.
Oh my God, I'm tongue-tied today, man.
You know what? You're not the first guy who's butchered a good Greek last name.
I guess you've been called worse, right?
So how are you? I'm trying to figure out what on earth we're going to talk about tonight.
I
I'm
love the
intrigued
fact that
since we've spoke, and you have just left me on the hook here.
I kept you in the dark, my friend. You know, Teo was asking, I'd like to be part of your discussion. I saw this announcement, but what product are you talking about? Because I didn't get any press releases or anything like that. I'm like, you know what? I'm keeping you in the dark because I want to see your reaction when I tell you the Denon processor that you can get that does 11 channels of processing for only $1,100.
So the way that you've billed this to me is that Denon has come out with a pre-pro for $1,100, and I can't figure out, even though I have a hunch what it is, what we're going to be talking about. Gene, as you know, I've always loved separates. I've been a separates guy for, wow, maybe 25, 30 years. My first unit was actually an NAD stereo preamp back in the day. And I just fell in love with the way separates were and the advantage of separates over time. And, you know, my upstairs setup is with separates, and my downstairs home theater, however, is the Denon 8500H, which is a spectacular unit. So it's all yours. You tell me what we're going to talk about.
Well, first of all, the 8500 is really, it does everything, right? It has 13 channels of amplification built in, 13 channels of processing built in, and it's got a preamp mode, which you actually physically disconnect between the preamp and the power amp, which is a great feature. I never really thought about this stuff too much until recently. Not only when we went to our Sound United event, I was thinking about receivers and the whole inflated power thing. But as I've been measuring receivers over the years, kind of a light bulb went off in my head, man. And I started noticing a pattern that I just kind of ignored for a while, but now I'm really digging into it. The thing, Teo, is you can get an AV receiver with preamp outputs, as most people do. They buy a mid-level AV receiver, and then if they want to add more power, they plug a power amp into it, at least for the front channels, right?
Right.
Well, the thing that I found in the past is some of the mid-price receivers of, 5-10 years ago, like some of the entry-level Yamahas, the 860 and maybe the model above that, they had pretty weak preamp outputs. Like they would clip at a little bit above 1 volt RMS. And I kept grilling Yamaha for years about this, that you need to have at least 2 volts RMS clean output, because most amplifiers will need at least 2 volts RMS to reach full gain. You know, most 200 watt amplifiers, for example, with a gain of 29 dB, take about 2 volts to get full power. If you look, for example, at the monoliths, the monoprice amplifiers, which is a really popular amplifier now because it's a great amplifier for the price, I think that needs about 1.6 volts RMS, maybe about 2 volts RMS to reach full power.
And Gene, let me pause you there for a second while we get into it. So we have a lot of people who are watching, a lot of people who are interested in what we're going to talk about, which I still don't know. But why don't you explain for the non-technical user why that voltage coming out of the pre-outs of an AVR is so important?
Yeah, like I was saying, if you get a preamp output of the receiver and it clips at 1 volt or 1.2 volts RMS, that means that anything above that drive level is going to send distortion into the power amplifier. So you're never going to hit full power out of that power amplifier. Now, I've run into this in real life. I know people are saying, well, you can see it on a bench, but it doesn't happen in real world. Yeah, it does. About 15 years ago, I set up a party system for my uncle, my in-laws, who are very, they like to have big parties. They're Colombian, so they have, 50 to 200 people at their parties. And as they get more liquored up and they start eating and drinking more, the volume levels go up, right? Well, I set them up with a Yamaha receiver of the time. I think it was the 2600, an older RXV 2600. And I used an Emotiva amplifier to supplement the power. It was an MPS-1, which was 200 watts a channel times 7 with a nice big RBH system. And what was happening when they were cranking it up is the receiver was shutting off. Not even the Emotiva amplifier, but the freaking receiver was shutting off. And when I finally went back there with my measurement devices, I started noticing that the preamp outputs were clipping at like 1.5 volts or 1.2 volts. And as you were cranking it up, the receiver went into protection mode. Not that the amplifiers were driving anything. The amplifiers are basically open circuited, but the receiver itself was protecting itself because it thought it was being overloaded. So that was a problem. You go and you buy a separate amplifier to supplement the power of your receiver, and your receiver is still the weakest link out of the preamp outputs.
That's a great explanation. So continue with what you were saying now.
Okay. So I've been looking at receivers a lot since the Sound United event. My head has been in receivers like crazy, man. I don't know what it is. It's like I'm inspired between the Truth and Power movement. I've been measuring a couple of different receivers. So what I want to do is I want to kind of share my screen with you guys. I hope this works because Google Hangouts gets really flaky sometimes. Tell me if you see my screen.
I see the Borg.
You see the
screen share.
Oh yeah, Captain Picard series is coming out, my friends. Okay, so let me see. Okay, so I wanted to kind of show you a little breakdown here. If you want, just ignore that bottom one for a minute. Can you see my screen?
Can see it just fine, yeah.
Okay, so if you want 11 channels of processing today for the cheapest amount of money, you have 3 options here that I've been looking at. You've got the Marantz AV-7705. You've got the Integra DRC R1.1, and you've got the Yamaha CXA-5200. Now these are, over $2,000. It's not at the $1,100 I was telling you about. And I'm actually reviewing the 5200. I did run into a snag with the preamp outputs for the main channels that Yamaha is now well aware of. The balanced outputs are causing more distortion than they should be, and they're looking at doing some type of a change. So that review is going to be delayed, unfortunately.
And Gene, I'd even add to that list, obviously one that I'm personally partial to is the Anthem AVM60.
Gotcha.
Which is what? With about $3,000, right?
Okay, so that's $3,000
$29.99 or so?
Yep, you're right. I forgot about that. Again, I'm trying to keep this price point at around the magic $1,000 price.
But Gene, to your point, and this is, I think, maybe where you're going to get to, if someone is looking seriously at an Atmos-enabled pre-pro, your absolute entry-level price point is going to be $2,200 or above. And you don't really have anything under that, do you?
Not if you want the latest in HDMI switching and you want immersive surround sound and you want 11 channels of processing. Right. So 11 channels of processing, just for anyone that's wondering, that gives you 7 bass channels. It gives you your front 3 LCRs, your side channels, and your back channels, and then it gives you 4 height channels. So 11 channels of processing is 7.1.4, just so in case anybody's wondering. And that's kind
some of these pre-pros too, Gene, in case you don't have the option for all the height channels, you can add 2 wides in place of that for a 9.1.2 if you wanted.
Yeah, you could do that for sure. But if you want to support the full capability of Atmos and DTS X in the home, the golden standard for that is 7.1.4.
Agreed.
Okay. So if you can't afford a dedicated pre-pro, your other option is receivers with preamp outputs. So I started looking at the receivers with preamp outputs, and you've got the NAD 758 V3, which is a solid receiver. But the problem with that receiver, it's $1,400, by the way. It requires external 4-channel amp because it only has 7 internal amplifiers built in, and you can't reassign the front channels, which is kind of, that kind of irks me, because if I'm going to buy a receiver and I'm going to use the internal amplifiers to power all of my speakers, but the most important speakers, in my opinion, are the front LCRs, or at least the front left and right. Because you know me, Teo, like you're a 2-channel guy. You want to put the best quality of your speakers and the best quality of your amplification towards the front of the room.
Absolutely. And it makes a big difference.
It, especially if you listen to music a lot.
Yeah.
So the NAD is a good option if you want to add a 4-channel amplifier, but you can't boost that front power unless you go and you now add a 6-channel amplifier. At that point, you might as well just buy a 7-channel amplifier, maybe save up and get the Marantz for $2,100. You know, I mean, that's just my opinion on that.
Yep, that makes sense.
Unless you just want to use all the internal amps and then just add a cheap 4-channel amp, you buy a used one or whatever, then you've got your 7.1.4. But I'm talking about actually supplementing your front and getting as close to separates level performance for $1,000 or so. So the next model is the Onkyo TX-RZ840 that just came out. And we've been talking about the 830 a lot because they were being blown out for like $500 or $600. And that was a class-leading receiver for the price. It was one of the first receivers that gave you native 11-channel processing for $1,000.
Got it.
And it's a solid amplifier. I think it's 120 watts a channel, 2 channels driven. The thing weighs like 33 pounds. It's got a meaty amplifier section for a $1,000 receiver, especially by today's standards when you're looking at, you know, receivers are getting lighter and lighter and they're packing more amplifier channels into it because they're trying to hit certain price points and put all these different streaming options and immersive surround and you name it, every feature but the kitchen sink.
Yep. And Gene, what I'm seeing you really point out here is a very interesting trend. As a consumer, I'm paying for X number of channels, but two things are happening. A, I'm losing 2 or 4 of those channels of internal amplification. And it's arguably my most important. It's my fronts that I can't then reassign. And I still have to purchase external amplification for my surround backs, which is to a degree not necessarily the most important pairing in a surround sound environment. So I'm not really getting the value out of that I would typically want in a receiver. And are you agreeing with that observation?
I agree with you that, and I'm gonna blow your mind about something else in a minute too. But yeah, you're 100% right. In my opinion, if you're gonna offer preamp outputs on a receiver, then the internal amplifier should be fully reassignable to whatever channels you want to use them for.
Right.
Okay. So you can't do that with Onkyo. You can't do that with Pioneer. I spoke to Onkyo about this when it was regarding the 830. They told me the 840 model that will not allow you to reassign, but that's something they're going to be looking at in the future because I'm grilling them on that as well. We finally got Onkyo to start rating their receivers 2 channels driven full bandwidth on their website. If you go to their website now, they've changed all their ratings thanks to our Truth and Power movement. So that's good. That's a good sign right there.
All right. So go down to what we have. What I like about the Yamaha is
wait. We're not done with the. I didn't do the Integra yet.
Okay.
Yeah. You're jumping the gun, man. You got to let it build up. You got to let it build up. You there?
I'm here. I was taking a drink of water in preparation.
Okay, I can't see you because I'm looking at my screen. All right, so I just reviewed the Integra DRX 4.2/4.3. You know, the 4.3 model is the newer version. They got rid of HD base T and they gave you wireless. That had a really good preamp output section on it. In fact, that was the highlight of my review, was the fact that you could use this as a pre-pro if you really wanted to, because the amp section was really weak on it, especially if we're driving 4-ohm loads. I would not use this receiver to drive a 4-ohm speaker to save your life on it.
Interesting.
But this was another receiver, because it's an Onkyo brand, it had the limitation where you can't reassign the front channels. So you would have to add that 2-channel amp to the surround backs. And now if you've got 4-ohm front, left, right speakers, which most good towers today are 4-ohm, let's put it that way, this receiver would have a problem really driving it at reference levels if your speakers, you know, are 4-ohm rated and they dip down even below that.
Okay.
So now we're left with the Yamaha, the 3080, which is their flagship receiver, which is a great receiver. It's got 9 internal amplifiers built in, but if you want to do 11 channels of processing, you have to add a 2-channel amp. Now, I think the amplifiers are reassignable in this. Don't quote me 100%. But what's keeping me from really recommending the current generation of Yamaha stuff right now is that XLR distortion output that I found from the CXA5200, which I'm sure is going to be the same problem with the 3080 because it's based on a volume IC control that they use. So I didn't test the 3080 yet, but I cautiously recommend that right now. If you're going to choose either the CXA5200 as a pre-pro or a Yamaha 3080, you better choose an amplifier that has a high gain structure of 29 dB or higher. Like maybe the monoprice amp might get you, might be okay with this preamp, even though it has higher distortion. The preamp outputs start getting some pretty not great distortion levels at around a little under 2 volts. So even though they're not clipping, they have a pretty noisy FFT because of what's going on with their volume IC. So I'm hoping Yamaha fixes this soon because I love the brand, but everybody has, you know, a hit or miss every now and then, you know.
And Gene, what I like about the design too is the fact that in an AVR, you're actually getting XLR or balanced outputs, which you typically don't find.
Yeah, exactly. You know, that is nice. That's the only AV receiver that has balanced outputs on the front preamps. But, you know, not to get up too far off topic, a lot of these processors that give you balanced XLR outputs, they're really not true differential outputs. They're just phase split outputs. So you're not getting the full benefit of balance in pretty much any of these products. You got to spend considerably more to get a fully differential preamp from input to output. But I don't want to go too far in that topic. We can talk about that another day. But what I do want to talk to you about is the Denon 11-channel processor that you can get for $1,100, and it is, in fact, a receiver.
Okay, that's just crazy.
It's the AVR-X3600H. I wasn't even excited about this receiver. When they announced it at Sound United event, I was like, oh, big deal. It's just a new iteration for the 3500, and they just added more channels. But actuality is it's a pretty big upgrade from the 3500. The 3500 only had 7 channels of amplification and processing built in. This thing goes from that to 9 channels of amplification built in with 11 channels of processing.
And that's an important point too, Gene. Just a quick sidebar. When we talk about some of these AVRs and even some of the pre-pros, they actually have more channels that you can process. And in the case of the Denon, correct me if I'm wrong, does this unit also do DTS-X and
Yes.
Auro 3D and Dolby Atmos, or does this one have Auro 3D omitted?
Auro 3D is omitted. You have to get to the 4500 model or higher. I can understand their strategy there because of the licensing fees they got to keep. Plus, they have to differentiate it from the next model up.
Mm-hmm.
But here's what's a couple of things that reason why I'm saying you can use this as a pre-pro and still use some of the internal amplifiers. The 3500 and the 3600 have the same power supply. I verified that with Denon Engineering. But Denon is pretty savvy about how they do their heat sinking, and they added a fan to the 3600, and they have, you know, more efficient heat sinking in the 3600 model. So they were able to add an extra 2 channels. That's why the power consumption went up a little bit if you look on the back panel.
Wow.
But if you look at the way this receiver is rated, just from the amplifier standpoint, it's 105 times 9. They measured 82 watts times 5 channels driven. And I believe it because I looked at the 3300, my test results from the 3300, which has the same power core, and it reached that 82 watts times 5 channels driven. Sound and Vision reviewed the 3400, which is the 2 models before this, and they rated it at 72 watts per channel times 7 channels driven at 0.1% distortion. That puts it on par with the kind of power that you get out of the NAD receiver. You know, NAD always brags about their all channels driven rating, right?
That's right.
Well, the NAD is, I think it's rated at 60 watts times 7 channels driven and 110 or 120 watts with 2 channels driven. So the Denon is comparable in terms of sheer output, but it has more channels. And the beautiful thing about the Denon, I'm going to show you this on the screen share here. Hopefully I can bring it up. Okay, you see the Denon, right?
Right.
Okay, so here's the back panel, just so everybody knows. There's all your preamp outputs for surround back, height 1, height 2. It's got dual subwoofer outputs, which the NAD does not have stereo subwoofer outputs, independent outputs. These are independent. So you could adjust channel delay and level for each subwoofer output. That's huge when you want to time align multi-sub.
And Gene, why don't we take a quick sidebar and explain to everybody, why are multiple subs important in a home theater setup?
Well, multi-sub, the idea behind multi-sub is you want to have bass good for every seat. And when you just use one subwoofer in a small room, it's kind of hard to dial in good bass for every seat with just one sub. You can get it for a general area, but usually if you've got, 4 or 5 seats in a room or 2 rows of seating, putting 2 subs in the room strategically located and then properly EQing it just flattens the bass out for a wider listening area.
So we get better, more consistent bass across seats. It's not necessarily for louder bass, which a lot of people think it is.
Correct. You do get some extra coupling below 30 hertz, like as if those 2 subs were co-located, even though they're not. But you definitely get some bass reinforcement below 30 hertz, even though they're not co-located. But your overall output level won't go up drastically adding 2 identical subs that are not co-located versus 1 sub.
That's great. And Gene, another quick sidebar is with this Denon unit, can I add a Y adapter to those 2 sub outputs and connect 4 subwoofers?
Yeah, you definitely could do that, or you could daisy chain your subs, run them in series with each other. I would, if you're going to Y split out, I wouldn't do more than 2 subs per output.
Yeah, agreed.
4 subs is all you would ever want to connect to a receiver like this anyway.
All right, so let's go back.
Okay, you got all your preamp outputs on this, but there's something I want to talk to you guys about that this is what I've been investigating a lot lately. By the way, here's the procedure if you want to figure out how to reassign your amplifiers. One thing I've always liked about Denon receivers for many years is they have fully assignable amplifiers for most of their products. So here's a step-by-step procedure of how to basically reroute those front channels to your surround back, or I'm sorry, to your height channels. So you reroute the front channels to another pair of surrounds, and now that preamp output for the main left and right channels physically disconnects from the power amp block, and now you've got basically a dedicated preamp output for the 2 channels, the front 2 channels, without any interference from any connecting amplifiers.
That's crazy. And Gene, you can then use any of those extra amplification channels to do either a zone 2 or a zone 3. So you're never really losing those amplifier channels if you can reassign them.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it actually comes in handy. It's got decent output. When you think about it, I mean, 70 watts of channels times 7, that's about the same amount of power you're getting out of that Emotiva 11 channel for the surround channels.
Exactly.
So, I mean, you're getting that kind of performance internally for all your surround speakers, and now you can go and add a really kick-ass, outlaw audio or monoprice amplifier or whatever you want to add for the 2 front channels and just really have clean output. And here's the thing, when you look at the output of the 3600's preamp outputs here, I asked Denon to provide me a output versus distortion chart, assuming the load was 10K, which most inputs of amplifiers are even higher than that. So this is kind of a worst case scenario. The preamp doesn't start clipping until you get to 4 volts.
Wow.
RMS.
That's great. From an AVR, this is the performance that we're seeing.
Right. Now here's the kicker. Here's what, people are probably saying, oh yeah, but okay, there's a lot of preamp outputs on receivers that give you greater than 2 volts. Well, here's the thing. When I was reviewing stuff, receivers in the past, this is the 3300 model, okay? I don't just do distortion versus power. I go look at it on an FFT analyzer to see what kind of harmonics, what kind of nasties you gotta get. So if you look at the old 3300 model, do you see this chart that says 1 volt RMS output?
Yep, can see it clearly.
Okay, the harmonic byproducts of that 1 kilohertz are down in the mud. They're down below 100 dB. So this is a really clean output for 1 volt.
Okay.
So So knowing that the preamp outputs don't clip until you get to 4 volts, I just assumed that at 2 volts it would look like that too, but I was wrong. Look what happened at 2 volts. All those odd order harmonics went way up. And I basically said in the review, well, I don't really understand why it's doing this. It's still probably not audible, but it's definitely not state of the art. And there's definitely advantages when you have a dedicated pre-pro and you couple it with a good amplifier, because you're not going to get this kind of behavior at 2 volts, right?
Right.
Well, I figured it out why it's doing this when I reviewed a Marantz SR8012. Here's the Marantz SR8012, which has really good outputs, but when it was driving above a volt, the odd harmonics started going up on this. And again, I'm like, what the heck is going on? Well, after talking to Denon Engineering, what I found out was all of the internal amplifiers of their receivers hit full power at about 1.2 volts RMS. Let me stop sharing the screen so you can see me.
Okay.
Okay. Do you see me?
Yeah. Can see.
Okay. So most receivers, especially in the Sound United brands, their amplifier stages hit full power at 1.2 volts RMS. So if you don't physically disconnect the preamp section from the power amp section, and you're cranking it up and you're going to 2 volts on that preamp output, even though the preamp output's not distorting, that power amplifier that's connected to it is at full clipping. Even though there's no load attached to it, that thing is hitting the rails, it's injecting noise back into the preamp section. And that's why those FFTs were getting nasty. So anytime you don't decouple the preamp from the power amp and the receiver, and that power amp inside that receiver is clipping, you're going to see that kind of behavior. And that could explain why some people think that dedicated pre-pros are cleaner sounding than their counterparts in receivers.
Wow. And it's interesting because you and I have talked offline. We've now done, some of these reviews, and especially when we were down in New Orleans back in May, and we were talking specifically about the 8500 and some of the preceding models. This is one path that Denon has done on several AVRs now, where you're now having the preamp section disconnected from the amplifier in that particular pre-out mode.
Yeah, exactly. Now the 3600, what's beautiful about that is when you reassign those front channels, it physically disconnects that amp section. So the preamp outputs on the 3600 for the front channels is clean as a whistle.
Wow. So Gene, I'm going to make an assumption here. I know what you're talking about because I've had those particular units in for review. Let's pretend that we have some of our audience here who has no idea about how that works with the Denon AVRs that we're talking about. So you went through those steps previously, and first of all, Denon Marantz, in my opinion, has probably one of the best GUIs or graphic user interfaces on the market when it comes to their AVRs and pre-pros. It's A1. And when you go and you configure your speaker layout, because remember, anytime we're talking about home theater immersive audio, you're mapping your speakers to a predefined layout. Once you select your layout, there's a mode called amp assign mode, and you can put all of your speakers into that. And once you're in that mode, it disconnects all the channels that you're not assigning to a particular speaker, correct?
Yeah, that's on the higher end models, because not every receiver has the ability to do that. And I'm pushing for the manufacturers to start offering preamp modes. Yamaha used to have it, believe it or not, on the Yamaha RXZ7, which is the last RXZ line that they made until they went to Avantage. They had a preamp mode, and it was like, at the time I was like, if you're not shutting the amplifiers off, they're still idling power and they're still wasting power. What the hell's the benefit of that? But years later, I now realize there's a huge benefit for that, because you're taking that signal path away. So you're never clipping those amplifiers, and you're never adding that distortion back into your preamp outputs.
Wow. So going full circle, what we're really seeing then is you can make a value investment in an AVR at an $1,100 price point. And it's a significant investment, to be sure. But what you're then able to do is assign whatever amps you want. In some cases, you could even buy amp. You reassign those to a second or third zone so you don't lose the value of the AVR, but you're then able to get dedicated amplification to the channels that matter most in home theater and really get the performance. So for the price of a dedicated pre-pro, you could get similar, or in some cases, theoretically identical performance with all your amplification done.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, if you're going with relatively small speakers all around and you just want to have a really nice front stage, I would venture to say I would take this model, this 3600 receiver, over one of those entry-level processors, maybe with the exception of the Anthem, because it's got Anthem Arc, which is a really good room correction system. But I would get the 3600 and use it all the internal amplifiers except for the front stage. I would maybe get a monoprice 2-channel or a 3-channel amplifier and add that to the front stage, because again, I'm focused on mostly on 2-channel music anyways, and I like to have very dynamic capable front speakers. And this is the only receiver right now on the market for around $1,000 that gives you that disconnect for the preamp output on the front channels, and it allows you to reassign those front channel amplifiers to use in a surround capacity. So all you have to do now is add a 2-channel amp, and you've got 11 channels of processing with quality amplification for your front channels.
I mean, that's crazy.
Yeah, it just hit me like a couple of days ago. I'm like, I got to do a YouTube video on this. I know people are going to say, oh, it's bait and switch. You just tricked us into buying a receiver. But this thing is more than a receiver for its price. It's more than meets the eye, my friends. I got to give Denon credit for what they did. They really leapfrogged the previous model before this.
And Gene, how can I say, one of the things that I've always looked at with a pre-pro, and this just goes back to, I think, whatever my influence was 30 some odd years ago, is what's happening at the volume stage and the way that the things are designed at the point of input. And when we were down in New Orleans and we had the opportunity to speak with some of the Sound United folks, and we had some great conversations, especially with Yamaha. And what is it about these latest incarnations of Denon and Marantz units where they have addressed some of these issues at the chip level that really makes that volume control also a game changer? Do you want to talk to that a little bit?
You know, I think you were following that situation more closely than I was on the forum. I think there was a guy on our forum that was really into that. And
yeah,
it looked like Marantz put a lot of effort into their volume control circuitry. Years ago, I had a Denon receiver, or was it the Pre-Pro? I think it was an AVP Pre-Pro, and it ran into dynamic range issues when it added a bunch of processes on top. So when you put in THX processing, and you put in Odyssey, and you put in Dolby True HD, you put in like 4 or 5 different processes on at once, and the volume had to scale back so it wouldn't cause any distortion at any level. And there came a point where when I had Odyssey engaged, I couldn't put the thing loud enough because it would scale the volume back so low that if I wanted to really play at reference levels, I had to turn Odyssey off. Well, I know that was, at the time, that was a limitation of the volume IC scaling capabilities, and I know that they've addressed that since then. I'm talking about 15 years ago. So, and now we've got all these other processes on top. So you definitely have to look at the chips and know what you're using these days, because there's so much processing that goes on behind the scenes. And I really do believe Marantz, Sound United, Denon, you know, I think they got a firmer grasp right now than a lot of the rest of the industry, just because they're producing so many different receivers and they're seeing so many different installation configurations and scenarios. And they're on the bleeding edge, especially when it comes to HDMI. They really have their HDMI solution bulletproof. And we saw, you know, and I'm not trying to trash talk any brands, because I like all these brands. I love Yamaha. It's heartbreaking to me, the problem I found in the Yamaha processor, because I just wanted that to be an easy review. I've got the CXA 5100 right now, and I think it's the best built processor for the money. It's just my only complaint about that processor is the HDMI switching is slow because they're using older HDMI chips. And I really like NAD. because they do give you truth and power with their amplifier sections. But we found with their $6,000 pre-pro, their HDMI had some issues. It wasn't perfect. But when it comes to bulletproof HDMI, it's like Sound United really does have bleeding edge technology in their processes. So when you get a receiver like the 3600 that has HDMI 2.0, it also has HDCP 2.3, the latest copy protection. You're not even getting that in most of flagship processors today. And in fact, the new Onkyo that's just coming out, it's HDCP 2.2 with a firmware upgrade to 2.3. So they're still lagging behind. I mean, the Denon is already shipping with 2.3 protocol.
No, it's true. I think you raise another extremely valuable point. Let's go back to the beginning of when we started the conversation, and we're starting to list all of these pre-pros. We're listing an Anthem, we're listing a Marantz, we're listing whatever it may be, and whether you're into 11 channels or 13 channels of processing, these aren't cheap units. And what are we really getting today is we're getting now just the tail end of the 2.0 HDMI spec. 2.1 is on the horizon. We could debate whether now is a good time to jump and the values of that. But the preamp is arguably that section is what gets obsolete fastest of probably any piece of audio gear that we're talking about. And to your point, again, is to be able to now get down theoretically to half of that price point, down to about $1,100.
Yeah.
And you're theoretically now getting that performance of separates and being able to add your amplification of choice. That really is something that's game changing.
Yeah, because if you think about it now, if you go and spend the $2,000 or the $3,000 on one of those other processors that I mentioned, whether it's the Marantz 7705 or the Integra, Yamaha, or Anthem, none of those are really upgradable. They're not modular designs. I mean, I think out of all of them, the NAD one is modular, and they've been supporting upgrades, but that's a $6,000 processor. That's not, that's 6 times the price of this receiver. So it's hard. Even if you go and buy a dedicated $2,000 or $3,000 pre-pro today, there's no saying that that's not going to be obsolete in 5 years, just like this 3600 receiver is. But I don't know. I think we're at the point now where we've got most of the technology we need. But I hate to say that because I made a video before Atmos came out saying, you're not going to go anything. You're not going to need anything but Dolby True HD and DTS HD. You don't need anything else. And then like 6 months later, Atmos hit the scene and everything changed.
And to everybody, guys, if you have never experienced a properly set up immersive audio system, you have no idea what you are missing. It's not a gimmick. It's absolutely positively the real deal. And it is something that is mind-blowing to experience. Gene, I got together with Cal Rubinson from Stereophile. We went out for drinks a week ago, whatever it was, and he gave me a Nordic Sounds Blu-ray that he had, and it has an Oro 3D, a Dolby Atmos mix, and he's like, listen to this. And if you followed Cal on Stereophile, he's been a big proponent of multi-channel audio. So I popped it into my Atmos setup, and I have to tell you, I just can't go back. As much as I love 2-channel, I'm addicted to 2-channel. I'm really a 2-channel guy. When you hear multi-channel music recorded and mixed the right way, the space just disappears. And look at what we're talking about. We've now lowered the price point. We've made the entry level available. We're getting quality preamplification section and being able to add either, again, something like a mono price. And I have, as you know, I have the Monolith 7, and that's what I've traditionally paired with my Denon AVRs as external amplification. It just makes all the difference.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's great that we're at these price points now because it gives you options. I've always told people, buy the best amplification you can because that doesn't obsolete. You can hang on to that amplifier for a long time. So now that you can get basically a pre-pro for half the price of a dedicated pre-pro, you could put that extra 1,000 towards a really good 2 or 3 channel amplifier and do justice for your front soundstage. And then years later, who knows, if that receiver really does obsolete in 5 years, you could use it in another room and just set up a basic 5.1 or 7.1 system. Whereas an old processor, you know, then you still have to have an amplifier to put it in another room when it becomes obsolete. At least with the Denon, you can take that and put it in a bedroom system 5 years from or 10 years from now, and then go and get a dedicated pre-pro if you want, if you've got the budget at that time.
That's true. And Gene, you're also getting something else that's, I think, a byproduct here. We're starting to see that a lot of these AVRs and the pre-pros are part of a whole home ecosystem. And when we start getting to Denon, we're talking about Hios, right? So whether you're talking about Marantz, Denon, some of these brands, so you don't lose the value of your investment because you have that streaming platform that you can just add as part of your home ecosystem. So the value goes way beyond just some of that processing power and the codec support, et cetera, that changes over time.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, you got a lot of cool features in this thing with Hios and all your different streaming for Tidal and Cubas. And I mean, it's just, there's so much these things do now. You got to give them credit. I know people want to harp on, you know, the power is not up to spec or whatever, and I've been pretty critical about that. But considering what you're getting now in these receivers, and then this one is pretty solid. You're getting decent power with up to 7 channels driven. It's really, it's hard to complain about anything. The only thing I'm going to start asking receiver companies now is to either give us 2 options: to either offer a preamp mode on these receivers that physically disconnects all or at least the front 3 channels, so you don't run into this clipping problem, or to change the gain instructions inside their receivers so that their power amp sections don't clip until they hit 2 volts. We got to have a good clean 2-volt RMS so we could be able to match with pretty much any amplifier on the market for people that want to expand and use those preamp outputs, because I can't stand when you get preamp outputs on a receiver and they're useless, like the old Yamahas I was telling you about that would clip a little bit above a volt, and then you couldn't use it in a party environment when you added external power. So that's a pet peeve of mine. I've been testing that with all the receivers I review. And just, you know, unfortunately, most of the industry doesn't measure anymore. So unless we measure and review it, or unless the manufacturer gives you that spec on the max output voltage for the preamp outputs, they usually don't. They usually give you just a reference voltage and an impedance, but they never tell you if that's a max output or not. So maybe we could kind of push them into doing that from now on as well.
That's going to be our next truth and power movement, right?
Yeah, you know, I really, I was thinking about it the other night. I'm like, my favorite component in home theater still must be the receiver, because the receiver has to do so much, and I'm so critical of them, but they do so much. But they are the most entertaining things when you think about it. At the end of the day, and I'm sitting in my family room listening to my system, and I look at that Marantz SR8012. I'm like, that thing is just a work of art, man. It's just a beautiful receiver. It's well built. It's, you know, it's almost to the level of the receivers from 15, 20 years ago, but it has all the latest technology in it and all the amount of processing it does. And it's just, I don't know, it's almost like an engineer marvel to me when I think about everything they do in these receivers.
You know, Gene, I think you raise a really important point. It comes down to usability. Why are we as consumers? Because you know what, we're blessed, I think, to have the ability to do these reviews, right? So we get to touch all this gear, we get to play with it, we get to interact with the manufacturers, give our, you know, feedback, opinions. But at the end of the day, you know, you and I, sometimes we're talking late at night. Hey, what are you doing? You know, I'm sitting down, I'm listening to music, or I'm watching a movie, or I'm doing this. And I like to enjoy my gear. I'm passionate about home theater. I'm passionate about music. And at the end of the day, I don't want to fight my gear. And,
Yeah.
you know, I've had review stuff come in. There's one particular model of a unit I'm thinking of. I got it in for review in June. I couldn't do the review till October because the product had so many problems. and I couldn't get it on the network. It was basically unusable at that point. But you know what? I sit down in the basement, and we're going to talk about Denon, so let me say that. I sit down with the 8500. I have no problem whatsoever with my home automation. I can use my not just the Denon app and it's bulletproof, but I can use a third-party integration system, and it just works. The Hios platform is rock solid. The UI is there. I can customize the GUI. There's so many things that I can do so that I'm focused on what my entertainment is, as opposed to fighting with the gear that's there. And I don't have necessarily Sound United gear every place else. You know, I've got my Oppo, I have an Apple TV integrated, I have all the other gear that's coming in and out, and I never have a problem. And I think that's, to your point, is what we're really trying to say is we love being brand agnostic, and we like all of these venerable brands who have a rich history that consumers are passionate about. And we say we want everybody to elevate their game so that at the end of the day, the consumer can pick the brand that they want and they know they're getting tremendous value and performance out of it.
Yeah, well said, man. You should be in the PR company or something. I did want to bring up one other point before I start answering some of these questions. There's a lot of questions here. I don't think I'm going to get to all of them. But the one thing cool about these receivers is they have that eco mode that I would use on eco auto, not eco on. If you're going to use the internal amps, never use eco on, because you will starve the receiver of power. But eco auto actually makes the receiver operate more like a class G or a multi-rail amplifier. So at low power, it goes on the low voltage rail and it consumes less quiescent current through all those amplifier channels, and it dissipates less power. Like my Marantz SR8012, for example, I could cook an egg on that thing if I turn the eco mode off of it. And that's just at idling, just not even blasting the thing out, because you've got, let's face it, these receivers were really designed to be 7-channel amplifiers in this small chassis, but they're cramming now 9, 11, or 13 channels. So when you have that many channels crammed into a similar sized chassis, you're going to dissipate a lot of heat, especially if it's still class AB amplification. So Eco Auto is awesome because it cuts the power at low volume levels where you're not going to notice it, and it dissipates less power while the thing is idling, and the receiver runs a lot cooler. And then when you crank the volume up, when it hits thresholds, I don't know what the threshold is on any particular Sound United receiver, they're probably all different. But when it hits a certain threshold, it switches to the higher rail voltage, and it gives you the more power, and it dissipates the more power. So an amplifier is more efficient when it's driving at near full power than when it's operating at a very low power level. So it's good that Denon is offering that on those receivers. I guess a lot of the brands are doing that now too. They must have some type of eco modes on them now. So I haven't really investigated it as much as I have on the Sound United products, but it's definitely a feature worth looking at, and wait for our test reports when we do these to make sure the Eco Auto doesn't starve your receiver. The latest generation, the Denons and the Marantzes that I checked, they do not starve your receiver or your amplifier or your speakers of power.
Right.
So they're a very viable option to use.
No, good point. And Gene, while you're looking through some of the questions in the chat, let me just summarize what my personal opinion is on this. I think it's exciting that we have this option for an AVR to be used as a pre-pro. And if I was making some recommendations on, you know, what would I do as a consumer? The first thing that I would do is I would say absolutely positively, if budget is an issue, go with a 2-channel external power amp. That's exactly where I would put my money. And to your point earlier, if you can do 3 channels up front, that's the most important thing. Anything over and above that is gravy. If you want to do a 5 or a 7, but I don't think, in my personal opinion, that if you have a receiver, someone needs to do 11 channels of external amplification, because I just haven't really experience the full benefit of that with a typical, you know, just 4 height channels. I think that the internal amplification of an AVR of what we're talking about would be fine with that.
Yeah, there's not a massive amount of content going to those high channels. I mean, you're going to be fine with the internal amps. I don't think that's a problem at all. Now, I did see a question that kind of really fly in here or something. That kind of resonated with me that I want to answer here. It says by Josh Peters, why do separates without any amplification cost 3 times more than something like the 3600 receiver that's essentially providing identical processing power? It's all about economies of scale, because the problem is for every Marantz 7705 that Marantz sells, Denon probably sells 15 or 20 of the 3600. So that lowers the production cost of that product. And that's why a lot of the Japanese companies for many years were hesitant about doing dedicated pre-pros. Like Yamaha, for example, before they came out with the CXA 5000, their argument was, we don't need to come out with a pre-pro because we've got the RX-Z11 receiver, which has state-of-the-art of everything. And if we did a pre-pro based on that receiver, it would be the same price, but without the amplifiers. Well, I guess they finally figured out a way to do it, or they don't do a flagship receiver like they used to anymore. Now it's the 3080 stops at around $2,000, and their pre-pro is a little bit more expensive, and it does have some upgrades in it over their regular receivers. But you can see the point is they don't sell a lot of those pre-pros, and pre-pros have a much lower volume level than an AVR does. And that's why usually AVRs get the latest technology before the pre-pro does. You know, the AVR product cycles are 8 to 10 months, whereas a company might not change its flagship pre-pro. They might change it only once every 3 or 4 years.
And Gene, is there anything, typically what you do get with a pre-pro is you get balanced output as an option throughout. And again, we talked about whether it's fully, truly balanced all the way through input to output, but don't you think that that also adds a little bit sometimes to the cost factor and to the appeal?
Yeah, it definitely adds to the cost factor, because now you got more connectors and you've got the phase splitters on each output. So, and it does add to the appeal. I mean, you do want to go balanced, even though most balanced, quote, balanced AVR or processors are really not fully differential. I still would like to have balanced outputs, assuming that there's no issues with how they did the phase splitting or the volume control or anything like that. And the nice thing about getting a dedicated pre-pro is you're not dissipating all that power with unused amplifiers, which can be a problem when you're dealing with 11 or 13 channel receiver. So if you're buying a 13 channel receiver like the Denon 8500 and you have no plans on using any of the internal amps, why are you spending $4,000 on a receiver? Just go get the AV 8805 or even the 7705. Well, that's only 11 channels of processing, but go get the AV 8805 and then just get yourself a separate amp if that's the route you're going. But if you know that you just need, you know, a 2 or 3 channel amplifier and you want to save some money, this 3600, man, this is the real deal. This is the showstopper for $1,100.
Wow.
So
what other good questions do we have?
Well,
in
why
the
don't you
chat
look?
room?
Yeah, there's a lot of them here. There's a lot. Someone was asking that Youthman is doing a review of the Monolith 11, that he doesn't think it's going to hit all power, all channels driven with just a 15 amp line. You know, Mono or ATI is very conservative with their power ratings, and they put 2 giant toroids in there, so it's going to give you whatever the wall power is capable of. If that thing is rated at 200 watts times 3, and then 100 watts times 8, that's a total of 1,400 watts. And if you say it's about, let's say it's 0.7% efficient, I'm going to be nice, you would need 2,000 watts available from your wall current. So you would need a good, it would do it if you had a 20 amp line. Yeah, it would do it. Not that you're ever going to run all 11 channels simultaneously, but whatever that Monolith amplifier is rated at is going to be very conservative based on every ATI amplifier I've ever reviewed or measured. So that's the real deal in 11 channel amplifiers. The Monolith 11 is the best. If you want something better than that, you got to spend, I think it's like $10,000 to get the Storm Audio 16 channel amplifier that uses the Pascal Class D amplifiers in them. That thing is, it's nice, but do you want to spend 10 grand on an amplifier? I don't know. So let's see what else we have here. The Truth or Receivers Warning, get external amp. Pre-pros for $2 grand. Good luck. The Emotiva RMC5 is $5,000. Yeah, well, nobody's been reviewing the RMC5 yet because they've been having some HDMI or switching or something issues from what I read on the forums. So I haven't seen any formal reviews of that processor yet. Looks like it'll be a great processor once all that's worked out, but that is $5,000, and that does 16 channels of processing. So that's kind of, you know, the Cadillac of processors, if you will. Let's see, what else do we have here?
Gene, while you're looking, it's worth noting the other thing you mentioned about a 20 amp circuit. If people haven't been following all the times we've talked about it, if you can put a dedicated 20 amp circuit for your gear in your home theater, you'll get probably at least a 10% performance improvement on the power output of your amps.
Yeah, that's a good rule of thumb, especially if it's a shared line and you're putting other stuff on it. I made the mistake years ago of using just a regular 15 amp line for a pretty substantial receiver I had plugged into one of my systems, and I didn't know it was shared with one of the outlets in the bathroom. So anytime my daughter would turn her hairdryer on, it would cause problems. So you definitely, if you could do a dedicated line in your room, I know a lot of people are into getting all these mega amplifiers, but then they just plug it into a shared line and you defeat the whole purpose of it at that point. Let's see. Someone bought a 5,000 Outlaw for model 5,000 for $599, no tax, free shipping. Yeah, that's a good amplifier, that 5-channel amp. Someone says they could get an AV-7705 $1299 B stock in Canada. That's a good deal. You know, I'm talking brand new though, so it's, you can't really compare B stock or used to retail. Spock 7 of 9, what feature? I don't know what that. 7 of 9 is going to be in the new Picard series. I'm kind of, you know,
You and I will talk Star Trek once we're done here.
I know. I'm kind of excited about that. The trailer it's promising. I just hope they don't do the lame route of Discovery and use identity politics to push forth an agenda. So I hope it's like the old Star Trek used to be, and I hope it has the spirit of at least, you know, what Gene Roddenberry originally created. Let's see. Bach, they can reassign, but I don't think they can be powered off. Yeah, you know, that's the one thing is I haven't seen any receivers that you can actually turn the rail voltages off for the power amps. There must be a reason why they don't offer that. It's probably costly, whatever relays they have to put in there, and they figure most people won't use it. So pretty much, even if there's a preamp bypass mode, those amplifiers are always going to be on. They're just going to be idling.
Gene, that's a good point, and I'm glad it was mentioned in the forum, because when we were doing one of the reviews, we saw in print some people had misunderstood what it means to disconnect the amplification section, and they noted that it was turned off, which is not the case.
Correct. Yeah.
So that's an important nuance for people to understand.
Yep, certainly is. So that's about all I've got, guys. I mean, I know there's a bunch more questions I can go in and answer after this. I think we've pretty much hit the topic pretty hard. The Denon 3600 really is one hell of a receiver, feature-wise and configurability-wise, and even performance-wise for, you know, the hot $1,100 or $1,000 price class.
So, Gene, you surprised me.
I'm glad I did, man. You know, I got to keep it real. There's nothing scripted here. We just speak our mind and we see what happens. And I think we made some magic tonight by you not knowing what we were going to talk about.
It was good. So all my Google search history, I'm going to erase about this mystery Denon Pre-Pro for $1,100, and I thought it was great. So great insights. I think it's really the culmination of people don't know things you and I have been talking about now for many months behind the scenes, and I'm glad you've been able to really get some of this stuff on the bench and put it out, because it's great gear. It's great gear. It's an investment, but you know, guys, it's the real deal, and it's about enjoying music and getting closer to your passion.
Awesome. Well, Teo, thanks for coming here and joining the discussion, because it's kind of annoying. It's kind of boring when I talk to myself. So it's good to have someone in the background with the Captain America shield behind you. And it's just, it works.
Well, I like it. And for everybody who keeps asking, yes, it's an aluminum shield. I got it a couple of years ago, and I love it. It's one of my prized possessions.
Awesome. Well, guys, I hope you like this video. Please thumb it up if you do. And join our Patreon channel at patreon.com/audioholics. You get advanced access to content that we don't publish here all the time. And we give you notices of different articles that are going to go live on Audioholics. There's just a lot of benefits to becoming a patron for ours. We also have an Amazon influencer page that we started creating. I'm going to be throwing products in there based on what we've reviewed or what we recommend. So it's just an exciting time now to be an audioholic as we approach the holiday seasons in a few months. We're going to be hitting Cedia in September to look at all the new products to give you the latest scoops on that. And my friends, I hope you enjoy this. Think about getting separates using this receiver. I think it's a great tip for you to consider. And until next time, keep listening.